Next year, the WHO will vote on amendments to the proposed International Health Treaty, an agreement on the part of 194 member nations to install the WHO as global health dictators. These amendments, originally proposed by the Biden government last year, would give the WHO the power to require member nations to participate in lockdowns, mandatory masking, mandatory vaccinations, and restrictions on movement. All of it authorized under international law and enforced by trade sanctions on countries that do not comply. That is just the tip of the iceberg. Shabnam Palisa Mohammed is a human rights activist, lawyer, and journalist from South Africa, and also sits on the steering committee of the World Council for Health, an apolitical international health advisory organization. Shabnam is an expert on the international health regulations, the WHO International Health Treaty, and on the proposed amendments. She joins me today from her home in South Africa to discuss not just the amendments and what we as the peoples of our individual nations can do to push back against them, but perhaps more importantly, to reveal how the WHO is simply one head of what she calls the Hydra of the globalist agenda, and where that agenda is headed next. Shabnam, it's a pleasure to have you on the show.
Thanks, Will. It's been a long time coming, and I'm just so glad to be in conversation with you.
And that's because both of our schedules are so busy. So, folks, I have to come clean to tell you that Shabnam and I have actually known each other for quite some time. She is on the steering committee of the World Council for Health, as I mentioned in my introduction. I've had the pleasure of being involved in some of the WCH meetings as well. And we've been working now for months to try to find a time when we could both do this, to have this very important discussion about the WHO, the International Health Treaty, but more importantly in the broader spectrum, how this is all connected with things like the UN and the WEF. But Shabnam, where I want to start, because of course you are an expert in this, is there's a lot of confusion, and even I myself was confused for a while about the difference between the international health regulations and the World Health Treaty, the WHO Health Treaty. They're different things. And so just to give some foundation, could you give a brief explanation of the difference between those?
Absolutely. So the World Health Organization, first of all, is an agency of the United Nations. So that's the head of the Hydra. And it's a small agency with enormous amounts of power and influence because they purport to be concerned with our health, and they have unelected representatives from around the world, including our countries, who do not account to us or take our consent on the decisions that they make. The latest missiles that have been launched through the WHO over the last 3 years include amendments to the international health regulations, as well as a new pandemic treaty running simultaneous to each other. In effect, both these pieces of legislation, and I say that in inverted commas because I do not regard them to be lawful and legitimate in any way, would usurp many of our individual as well as sovereign nation rights and responsibilities. One of those which is particularly concerning and disturbing and should be infuriating is that it would give the Director General of the WHO the right to declare a public health emergency of international concern, or FAKE, in your country, even if your country disagrees. That, of course, is absolutely terrifying. But these amendments and these new treaties also come with a whole other barrage of human rights violations, including the upscaling of surveillance, digital vaccination-proof certificates, as well as infringements on the right to dignity, including forced quarantine if you have an illness or you're suspected of having an illness, which interestingly is lockstepping with some of the legislation that our governments are trying to impose in our own countries. So they certainly are working in concert with each other. And one example with that would be South Africa and New York State, just on the subject of quarantines. And there is a movement on that in that regard. But moreover, I think it is important to understand that the WHO is moving towards, instead of being an agency that shares recommendations, it's now moving towards its recommendations becoming binding and mandatory. And it seems like none of the unelected representatives that attend the World Health Assembly meetings or these international negotiating bodies on the treaty or the working group in the IHR actually care that these would become mandatory, and what kind of financial burden it would impose on your country to have to maintain this behemoth infrastructure and be in compliance with the WHO. Also bearing in mind, Will, a subject on this topic that I enjoy raising because people don't seem to quite realize it. It's not impossible for the WHO, perhaps through the World Trade Organization or even the United Nations, or just creating another superstructure, to instruct, influence, or impose sanctions on your country for not complying with the amendments to the IHR, the new pandemic treaty, or any other piece of legislation that they invent to usurp our human rights, primarily for the benefit of the big pharma cartel. So I think that's very important to remember. For me, it's important to also realize this is war. It is absolutely existential, and we have to take a stand against the WHO. The most important mission we're on in terms of the WHO is to defund and exit. 2021, last quarter of 2021 is when I came across this article on the new pandemic treaty and immediately saw red flags. So I took this to, the steering committee of World Council for Health and said, this is what's going on. We've got to spotlight it. November 2021, we held our first event. How much power should the WHO have? Thankfully, since then, there's been an escalation in the levels of awareness on what the WHO is doing. So now we have, thousands of individuals around the world. The WHO is under pressure. They keep highlighting the fact that there's disinformation groups around the world. But individuals, groups, and organizations mobilizing along the same track, that we have to defund and exit. In fact, in the US, there are bills, HR 79, for example, to defund and exit the WHO, which is fantastic to see. As sovereign nations, we have to make our own decisions about our health. And more importantly, as sovereign individuals, we must take responsibility to become radically healthy and take power away from the World Health Organization.
Absolutely agreed. And I think something we have to give a bit of a summary here, because you've alluded to this already, is the connection between the WHO and these other organizations. So let's just string some things together here. The WHO, as you and most of my viewers well know, it's a branch of the United Nations, which are in alliance with the International Monetary Fund, the World Economic Forum, and of course the WHO is part of that. But it's also significant to understand where the money's coming from. Yes, most people know the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is a primary contributor to the WHO, but we've also got the US government through the Department of Defense, which funded the manufacture and distribution of the COVID, quote, vaccines to the tune of tens of billions of dollars. We've got the US deep state involved. We've got a huge amount of funding coming from Germany. And so this is, as you've already said, this is a hydra. All these organizations are basically being controlled largely by the same group of people in order to establish global dominance. And the WHO and this health treaty, which, by the way, folks, the treaty was proposed, the amendments to it, really, the most important part of the amendments that Shavna was just referring to, in 2022 by the Biden government. So there's another connection there to the US government and the US deep state that's partly behind this. And so the WHO and this treaty is really just a club that they want to beat all of the countries of the world into submission with. And so how, and you already made reference to that, through, of course, sanctions, trade sanctions, whatever, if you don't comply. And there's even provision in here, not just for all of the member countries to have to comply, but to force non-member countries to comply.